People always want to point the finger, but they rarely want to look in the mirror. When a family walks onto my stage and tells me they have a monster in the house, the first thing I look for is who built the cage. You see, I've sat across from thousands of families over the years. I've seen every conceivable permutation of dysfunction, every flavor of betrayal, and every brand of toxic dynamic you can imagine. But there is a very specific kind of situation that always sets off alarm bells in my head. It's the one where parents sit there wringing their hands, shedding tears, and playing the completely helpless victims to a child they themselves raised. They want me to fix the broken machinery of their household, but they refuse to acknowledge who was running the assembly line. The briefing file sitting on my desk for this particular episode was incredibly thick. My producers had flagged it heavily. The family had submitted a tape, and the prevailing theme, the desperate plea from the parents, was that their daughter was entirely out of control. But the daughter had her own narrative. Her stance was clear, a defiant pushback against the narrative being spun about her. She was coming on the show with the attitude of a cornered animal, deeply invested in the idea that her family thought she was out of control, but she was finally going to broadcast her side of the story. The young woman at the center of this emotional hurricane was a 19-year-old named Riley. According to her parents, David and Karen, Riley was a walking, talking natural disaster. The laundry list of her transgressions was long and exhausting. They detailed incidents of her screaming at the top of her lungs in the middle of the night, disappearing for days without so much as a text message, punching holes in the hallway, drywall, and treating their home like a free hotel where the staff was entirely beneath her contempt. They painted a picture of a girl who had simply, inexplicably, spontaneously combusted into rebellion. They sat in their pre-interview chairs, looking exhausted and beaten down, presenting themselves as the innocent, well-meaning bystanders in the destructive path of a rogue tornado. But here is the truth of the matter. I do not buy into the theory of spontaneous emotional combustion. Human behavior makes sense if you look closely enough. We don't just wake up one morning, stretch, and decide to burn our lives and our relationships to the ground just for the sheer thrill of it. There is always a payoff. There is always a root cause. There is always a history that precedes the hysteria. When I sat alone in my office and watched the home footage they sent in, I didn't just see an out-of-control, spoiled young adult. I saw a profoundly angry, wounded young woman who was screaming at the top of her lungs to be heard by people who had their fingers shoved firmly in their ears. I look at the family as an entire system. You cannot pull one gear out of a clock, point out that it's spinning erratically, and ignore the fact that the springs and cogs around it are entirely stripped. David was a passive father, a man who had mastered the art of fading into the wallpaper whenever conflict arose. He preferred the path of least resistance, which usually meant retreating to his garage or his office, leaving his wife to handle the heavy lifting of parenting. Karen, on the other hand, was an overbearing, highly anxious, micromanaging mother who had unfortunately confused control with love. She hovered, she picked, she criticized, and she managed Riley's life with an iron grip, right down to the smallest detail, long past the age where that kind of parenting is appropriate or healthy. Riley's side of the story, as she laid it out in her own separate producer interviews, was a stark contrast to the portrait of a remorseless terror. She described a home environment where she felt completely suffocated. She talked about feeling like she was constantly under a microscope, where every single choice she made was evaluated, criticized, and ultimately found wanting. She felt she could never do anything right, so at a certain point, she simply decided to stop trying to be good and started excelling at being bad. If the only time she got her parents' undivided attention, the only time they actually looked at her and reacted with genuine emotion was when she was breaking the rules, then breaking the rules became her currency. She was cashing in on negative attention because it was the only attention that felt real to her. This is a classic dynamic, but it is incredibly destructive. The parents were right fighters. They wanted to be right more than they wanted to be happy, and they certainly wanted to be right more than they wanted to understand their daughter. They wanted me to look at Riley, point a finger at her, and tell her she was a bad seed. They wanted me to validate their victimhood, but my job isn't to be a judge handing down a sentence. My job is to be a mirror. My job is to hold that mirror up so close to their faces that they cannot look away from their own reflections. As I prepared to walk out onto that stage, I knew exactly what the energy in the room was going to be. It was going to be tense, it was going to be defensive, and it was going to be loud. Riley was walking out there ready for a fight, armed to the teeth with every grievance she had accumulated over 19 years. David and Karen were walking out there wrapped in their self-righteous exhaustion, expecting me to be their attack dog. What none of them realized was that I wasn't there to take a side. I was there to dismantle the entire illusion they had built around themselves. I was there to strip away the labels they had so conveniently slapped on one another. The label of out of control is a lazy one. It's a label that absolves the parents of responsibility and dooms the child to a self-fulfilling prophecy. We had to dig beneath that label. We had to go back to the beginning, to the quiet moments before the shouting started, to understand exactly how this family had lost its way so profoundly. The real work wasn't going to be about stopping Riley's tantrums. It was going to be about figuring out what those tantrums were designed to protect. When I walked out onto that stage and took my seat, the energy in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife. You can always tell a lot about a family before anyone even opens their mouth just by looking at their body language. David and Karen sat close together on one side, leaning into each other, projecting a united front of utter despair. Karen had a tissue clutched in her hand before I even said hello, dabbing at eyes that were already primed for weeping. David had that heavy, put-upon sigh ready to go, the kind of sigh that says, "Look at this impossible burden I am forced to carry." And then there was Riley. She sat on the opposite side, pushed as far back into her chair as the laws of physics would allow. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw was set like granite, and her eyes were darting around with a mixture of raw fear and absolute defiance. She looked like a prisoner of war who had just been dragged into an interrogation room. I started by laying out the timeline, because you have to understand that this level of toxicity does not happen overnight. I looked back at the developmental history of this family, and what I found was incredibly revealing. At 7, 8, 9 years old, Riley was the model child. She was eager to please, desperate for approval, and contorted herself into whatever shape her parents needed her to be. But adolescence is a funny thing. It is the time when a child is biologically and psychologically driven to individuate, to separate from the parents and figure out who they are as a distinct human being. It's a messy process under the best of circumstances. But in this house, individuation was treated like high treason. Karen could not handle the separation. I told her straight out that she was dealing with severe, unmanaged anxiety, and she had spent the last 2 decades using her daughter as a human shield against her own fears. When you are terrified of the world, you try to control everything in your immediate environment to feel safe. For Karen, that meant controlling Riley. She vetted every friend, monitored every phone call, picked out her clothes long past the age of reason, and dictated her schedule with military precision. If Riley showed an interest in something Karen didn't understand or approve of, it was immediately shut down. Karen thought she was protecting her daughter, but what she was actually doing was slowly suffocating her. She was sending Riley a very clear, very damaging message day in and day out. You are not capable of making good choices, you are not trustworthy, and you cannot survive without me pulling your strings. And where was David while all of this was happening? He was missing in action. I looked right at him and told him that his silence was just as destructive as his wife screaming. He played the role of the nice guy, the peacekeeper, but in reality, he was just a coward avoiding conflict. When Karen would back Riley into a psychological corner, David would literally walk out of the room. He justified it to himself by saying he didn't want to undermine his wife, but what he was really doing was abandoning his daughter to a completely unbalanced power dynamic. He created a massive emotional vacuum in that house, and nature abhors a vacuum. When a father withdraws his protection and his guidance, the child absorbs that absence as a rejection. Riley didn't just feel controlled by her mother, she felt entirely unprotected by her father. So, what does a teenager do when they feel trapped, unheard, and abandoned? They start testing the fences. They look for the weak spots in the perimeter. For Riley, the escalation began with small acts of sabotage. She started deliberately failing classes she had previously aced. She started wearing clothes she knew would send her mother into a tailspin. She began hanging out with kids she didn't even particularly like, simply because their presence in her life was a guaranteed way to trigger Karen's anxiety. It was a completely reactive existence. Riley wasn't building a life she wanted. She was actively destroying the life her mother had mapped out for her. It was a desperate, misguided reclamation of her own autonomy. She figured if she couldn't be the architect of her own success, she would at least be the author of her own disaster. The tipping point, the incidents that ultimately drove them to contact the show, were ugly. We played the tape of a blowout argument they had secretly recorded in their kitchen. It was agonizing to listen to. It wasn't communication. It was an escalating cycle of verbal abuse. Karen was shrieking, hurling accusations and character assassinations, calling Riley worthless and ungrateful. Riley was screaming back, using language designed to inflict maximum emotional damage, trying to shock her mother into silence. The tape ended with the sound of a sickening crash that was the moment Riley put her fist straight through the hallway drywall. The parents pointed to that hole in the wall as absolute proof of her insanity. But I told them to look closer. A teenager punching a wall isn't trying to destroy the house. She is trying to find a physical outlet for an emotional pain that is so overwhelming she literally cannot contain it in her own body. The pain of being entirely misunderstood is excruciating. Then came the disappearances. Riley would vanish for 2 or 3 days at a time. The parents would panic, file police reports, and expect me to label her a hardened runaway. But I pointed out a glaring inconsistency in their narrative. When Riley ran away, she never turned her phone off. She never actually dropped off the grid. She would go stay at a friend's house 3 blocks away and just ignore their calls. That is not a kid who is trying to escape her family forever. That is a kid who is staging a disappearance to see if her parents actually care enough to come looking for her. It is an incredibly dangerous, dysfunctional game of hide and seek. She was testing their love, pushing them to the absolute brink to see if they would fight for her or just write her off. And every time they greeted her, returned with anger and punishment instead of relief and conversation. The wedge between them was driven just a little bit deeper. They were locked in a death spiral of mutual resentment, and none of them had the tools or the humility to hit the brakes. I turned my attention directly to Riley. She had been sitting there watching me dissect her parents' behavior, and I could see a faint glimmer of validation in her eyes. She was thinking, finally, someone sees what they are doing to me. But I couldn't let her get too comfortable in that seat of righteous indignation. You see, understanding the root of a behavior does not excuse the behavior itself. It simply explains it. And right now, Riley was using her parents' dysfunction as a free pass to behave like an absolute terror. And that had to stop immediately. Riley, I said, leaning forward, locking eyes with her. You sit there and you point the finger at them. You say they're suffocating you, they're controlling you, they're driving you crazy. And you know what? You're not entirely wrong about the dynamic, but what you are dead wrong about is your response to it. You are 19 years old, you are legally an adult, but you are acting like a petulant toddler throwing a tantrum in the cereal aisle because she didn't get the toy she wanted. She bristled instantly. The defense mechanisms flew up faster than a rocket. You just said they were the ones suffocating me, she shot back, her voice tight and defensive. You just said my dad abandons me and my mom controls me. I did say that I agreed calmly, refusing to match her elevated volume, because it's true. They have made profound mistakes. But here is the hard truth you need to swallow today, Riley. You are not a victim anymore. You are a volunteer. You are actively choosing to participate in this toxic dance because, on some twisted level, the chaos feels safer to you than actually taking responsibility for your own life. I had to break through that hardened shell she had built. I had to show her that her rebellion wasn't strength. It was just a different kind of weakness. She thought she was being independent by rebelling. But true independence isn't about doing the opposite of what your parents want just to spite them. True independence is about making choices based on your own values, your own goals, regardless of their input. Look at your life right now, I challenged her. You're failing out of community college. You can't hold down a part-time job because you blow up at your managers the same way you blow up at your mother. You're punching holes in walls and running away to sleep on couches. You think you're punishing them? You think you're showing them who's boss? Riley, the only person you are destroying is yourself. You are burning your own house down just to prove you know how to use the matches. Tears sprang to her eyes, not tears of sadness, but tears of absolute frustration. It is incredibly painful when someone strips away the narrative you've used to survive and forces you to look at the raw reality of your choices. What am I supposed to do? She cried out, her voice cracking. If I try to do things my way, she's right there criticizing it, telling me I'm going to fail. She never believes in me. Then stop needing her to believe in you, I fired back. That's the umbilical cord you have to cut. You are waiting for Karen to suddenly wake up, give you her blessing, and tell you that you're a capable adult. I'm here to tell you that day may never come. And if you wait for it, you will wait your entire life. You are handing her all your power by constantly reacting to her, by constantly trying to prove her wrong through bad behavior. You are still letting her control you. You are just as controlled by her when you're rebelling as you were when you were obeying. That landed. I could see the physical shift in her posture. The defiance started to melt, replaced by a profound, exhausted realization. She had spent so much energy fighting against them that she had completely lost sight of what she actually wanted to fight for. I pivoted back to David and Karen. They had been watching this exchange, perhaps feeling a brief moment of vindication when I was tough on Riley, but I was about to turn the heat back up on them. You two, I said, my tone deadly serious. You brought her here wanting me to fix her. You wanted me to give you a magic wand to wave over her head so she'll go back to being the compliant little girl you can manage. I do not have that wand. And even if I did, I wouldn't use it, because she is never going back into that box. The harder you try to shove her back in, the more explosive she is going to become. I looked at Karen. Karen, you have to let go. You are gripping the steering wheel of her life so tightly that your knuckles are white and you are driving both of you right off a cliff. You have to let her make mistakes. You have to let her fail. You have to let her experience the natural consequences of her own choices without you swooping in to rescue her or worse, to say, I told you so. Your anxiety is not her responsibility to manage. And then to David. David, you need to step up. You need to stop hiding in the garage. You need to be a buffer. When Karen's anxiety spikes and she starts micromanaging, you need to be the one to step in and say, Karen, back off. Let her handle this. You need to start actively parenting, which means being present in the uncomfortable moments, not just the easy one. The confrontation was peaking. The air was charged, crackling with the electricity of years of unspoken truths finally being dragged out into the harsh studio lights. They were all raw, they were all exposed, and they were all staring at the wreckage of their family dynamic, unable to hide behind their comfortable excuses anymore. The blame shifting had stopped. Now, they were standing face to face with accountability, and it was a terrifying place for them to be. But it was the only place where real change could possibly begin. We had stripped away the anger, the blame shifting, and the comfortable narratives they had all been hiding behind. What was left was the raw, trembling underbelly of this family's dynamic. They were standing in the wreckage of their own making, and the silence that followed my confrontation was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens when people realize they can no longer lie to themselves or to each other. I let that silence hang there for a long moment. It's in those quiet, uncomfortable spaces that the real cognitive shifts begin to happen. All right? I finally said, leaning back in my chair, lowering my voice to a more conversational, measured tone. We know what's broken. We've looked at the blueprints of this disaster. Now, the question is, what are we going to build in its place? Because you cannot go back to the way things were. That house has burned down. I turned my focus entirely to Riley. She looked exhausted, like she had just run a marathon with a weighted vest on. The defiance was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that I hadn't seen since she walked onto the stage. Riley, I said gently but firmly, I'm going to make you an offer, and I want you to listen very carefully before you react. I want to send you to a specialized program. It's not a punishment. It's an opportunity. It's a place where you will be entirely removed from this toxic environment, away from your mother's anxiety and your father's avoidance. It's a place where you will work with professionals who will help you figure out who you are when you aren't just reacting to them. She looked up, her eyes wide, a mixture of fear and hope warring on her face. You mean away from them? She asked, her voice small. Completely, I confirmed. You need a reset. You need to learn how to communicate without screaming, how to process your anger without punching holes in walls, and most importantly, how to start building a life based on your own goals, not just tearing down the life they wanted for you. You have to learn how to be the architect of your own future. I watched the wheels turning in her head. This was the moment of truth. She could cling to the familiar chaos of her anger, or she could step into the terrifying unknown of taking responsibility for her own healing. It's a harder choice than people realize. Misery is comfortable when it's all you know. I'll do it, she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. I don't want to be this angry anymore. I'm just so tired. Good, I nodded. That's the first real adult decision you've made in a long time. Then I turned my attention back to David and Karen. They were watching Riley with a mixture of relief and trepidation. They had gotten what they wanted. Riley was getting help, but they were about to find out that the price of that help was their own active participation in the process. Now, for the two of you, I said, my tone sharpening just a fraction. Do not think for 1 second that because Riley is going away to get help, you are off the hook This is not a situation where you drop off a broken car at the mechanic and come back a month later to pick it up fixed. You are the environment she is going to return to. I looked directly at Karen. Karen, while Riley is gone, you are going to go into intensive therapy for your anxiety. You need to learn how to manage your fear without using your daughter as a control mechanism. You have to learn how to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing everything, of not controlling everything. If you don't do this work, the minute she comes back, you will slip right back into the same patterns and you will undo every ounce of progress she makes. Karen nodded slowly, tears silently tracking down her cheeks. I know, she whispered. I'm just so scared of losing her. You are losing her by holding on too tight, I told her plainly. The only way to keep a relationship with your adult daughter is to loosen your grip. I shifted my gaze to David. And David, you are going into therapy as well. You need to figure out why you are so terrified of conflict that you are willing to sacrifice your daughter's emotional well-being to avoid it. You have to learn how to stand your ground, how to support your wife without enabling her anxiety, and how to be a strong, protective presence for your daughter. You cannot be a ghost in your own home anymore. David looked down at his hands, then looked up at me, his face set with a new kind of resolve. I understand, Dr. Phil. I need to be a better father. You need to be an active father, I corrected him. You need to be in the game. The energy in the studio had shifted entirely. We had moved from a war zone to a triage center. The anger and the blame had been replaced by a tentative, fragile hope. It wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was going to be the hardest work any of them had ever done. Breaking decades-old patterns of behavior is like trying to turn an ocean liner around in a bathtub. It takes time, it takes immense effort, and it takes a willingness to constantly confront your own worst impulses. As we wrapped up the show, I watched them interact. It was stiff, it was awkward, but it was honest. There were no more dramatic sighs, no more defensive posturing. They were three people who had finally realized that they were drowning, and they had just agreed to stop pulling each other under and start swimming towards the shore together. The real test, however, wouldn't happen under the studio lights. The real test would happen in the quiet moments of their everyday lives, when the cameras were gone and the old habits beckoned like a siren song. They had the tools now, but tools are useless if you don't pick them up and use them. What happens after the lights go down and the audience goes home is, to me, the most critical part of the entire process. The show is the intervention. It's the loud, disruptive alarm clock that wakes you up from the nightmare you've been living. But the real, grinding, day in and day out work of changing your life happens in the quiet moments that follow. It happens in the therapist office, in the late night conversations where you bite back the old toxic response, and in the lonely moments when you have to sit with your own uncomfortable feelings instead of lashing out. The first few reports I got from Riley's residential program were exactly what I expected. She was resistant, she was defiant, she tried to play the same games with the therapist and the staff that she had played with her parents. She tried to shock them, to push their buttons, to find their weaknesses and exploit them. She was like a wild animal that had been put in a new enclosure, testing every inch of the fence for a way out. The staff there are professionals. They've seen it all 1,000 times. They didn't take the bait. They didn't get angry. They just calmly, consistently, and firmly held up the mirror and reflected her behavior back to her. Her breakthrough didn't come in a loud, dramatic explosion. Those are rarely the ones that stick. It came about 3 weeks in during a group therapy session. Another young woman was talking about her own father's emotional neglect, and Riley just started to weep. Not the angry, frustrated tears I had seen on my stage, but deep, gut-wrenching sobs of profound grief. For the first time, she wasn't just angry about what her parents had done. She was grieving what she had never had. She was grieving the father who never protected her, the mother who never saw her for who she was, and the childhood that had been consumed by a war she didn't start but had certainly helped to escalate. That was the moment her healing truly began. She stopped fighting the world and started looking inward. The reports started to change. Words like engaged, thoughtful, and accountable started showing up. She was learning to identify the feeling underneath the anger. She was learning that her rage was a secondary emotion, a protective shield she threw up to hide her fear of abandonment and her deep-seated belief that she was fundamentally unlovable. Meanwhile, back at home, David and Karen were having their own trial by fire. Karen's individual therapy was a struggle. The first several sessions, all she wanted to talk about was Riley. She wanted to know if the therapist thought Riley was making progress, if Riley was saying bad things about her, if Riley was going to come home and be normal. Her therapist had to continually redirect her, bringing the focus back to Karen's own feelings, her own history, her own crippling anxiety. It was like trying to teach a new language to someone who insists on only speaking their native tongue. The biggest challenge for Karen was learning to sit with the feeling of not being in control. Her entire sense of safety was tied to her ability to manage her daughter's life. With Riley gone, she felt adrift, terrified. She tried to get around the rules of the treatment center, calling multiple times a day, trying to get different staff members on the phone to give her information. The center had to set a firm boundary. One scheduled call per week, and that was it. For Karen, that was torture. But it was also the most therapeutic thing that could have happened. She was forced to develop other coping mechanisms. She started journaling. She started exercising. She started, for the first time in 20 years, to ask herself what she wanted, what she was afraid of, completely separate from her role as Riley's mother. David's journey was quieter, but no less profound. In their joint counseling sessions, he started to find his voice. It was shaky at first. I remember getting a report from their therapist about a session where Karen started to spiral, catastrophizing about what would happen when Riley came home. The old David would have shut down, stared at the floor, and waited for the storm to pass. But this time, he put his hand on her arm and said very quietly, "Karen, we have to trust the process. We have to trust her." It was a simple sentence, but it was a seismic shift in their dynamic. He wasn't abandoning the conversation. He was entering it as a calm, steadying partner. Karen, of course, initially bristled at this, but David didn't back down. He just held his ground. He was learning that being a peacekeeper wasn't about avoiding conflict at all costs. It was about having the strength to bring calm into the conflict. The family was being deconstructed and rebuilt piece by piece, all in separate locations. They were learning to function as individuals so that they could hopefully come back together and function as a healthy unit. This is the part of the journey that is never shown on television. It's not glamorous, it's slow, it's often frustrating, and it involves a lot of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But as the weeks turned into a couple of months, I saw a pattern of progress. It was fragile, absolutely. One major stressor could have sent the whole house of cards tumbling down. But for the first time in over a decade, they weren't just reacting to each other's dysfunction. They were actively, consciously, and painfully working to create something new. The reunion was carefully orchestrated. It didn't happen on my stage under the hot studio lights. That would have been performative and counterproductive. Real change is tested in the real world. Riley had been in the program for nearly 4 months. She had made incredible progress. She was no longer the volatile, cornered animal that had sat across from me. She was calmer, more self-aware, and had developed an entirely new vocabulary for expressing her emotions. She could now say, when you do that, it makes me feel scared and small instead of just punching a hole in the wall. The reunion took place in a neutral setting at their family therapist's office. I wasn't there in person, but I received a detailed report from the therapist who facilitated the session. I'm told that when Riley walked into the room, the tension was palpable. David and Karen both looked terrified, as if they were meeting a stranger. And in a way, they were. They were meeting the version of their daughter that had been buried under years of anger and reactive behavior. Karen started to cry almost immediately, and her first instinct was to rush forward and hug Riley. The therapist gently intervened, asking everyone to take their seats first. This was crucial. They had to break the old pattern of emotional flooding and establish a new, more deliberate way of interacting. According to the report, Riley was the one who spoke first. She looked directly at her parents, and with a voice that was clear and steady, she began to take accountability for her own part in the family's destruction. She apologized for the screaming, the name-calling, the disappearances, and the violence. She didn't make excuses. She didn't say, I did it because you. She simply said, I did it, it was wrong, and I am sorry for the pain and fear I caused you. That single act of unprompted, unconditional accountability completely disarmed her parents. It was something they had never experienced from her before. It took all the fight out of the room. David, I'm told, just openly wept. Karen was stunned into silence. Then it was their turn. Guided by the therapist, Karen talked about her fear. She admitted, for the first time without trying to justify it, that her control was a manifestation of her own anxiety. She apologized for not trusting Riley, for not seeing her as a capable person, and for making her feel like she was never good enough. David apologized for his passivity. He called it what it was, cowardice. He told Riley he was sorry for every time he walked out of the room, every time he failed to stand up for her, and for leaving her to navigate her mother's anxiety all alone. It wasn't a magic wand. It didn't erase a decade of pain, but it was a beginning. It was the first time the three of them had ever sat in a room together and spoken the truth without using it as a weapon. They weren't trying to win. They were just trying to understand. Now, I've been doing this long enough to know that one good therapy session does not mean a happy ending. The real work began when Riley moved back home. They had new rules of engagement. They had a family contract that they had all worked on. It included things like mandatory weekly family meetings, a cool-down rule where anyone could call a timeout during a heated discussion, and a commitment from Karen not to ask Riley more than one question about her plans for the day. It sounds simple, almost silly, but for a family like this, these structures were a lifeline. There were setbacks, of course. About a month after she came home, Riley had a bad day. She got into a minor fender bender, and her first instinctual reaction was to revert to her old self. She came home ready for a fight, expecting her mother to lecture her about being irresponsible, and Karen started to go there. The old script was powerful, but David stepped in. He put his hand on Karen's shoulder and said, "She's okay. The car is just metal. Let's all just take a breath." He then turned to Riley and asked, "Are you all right? That must have been scary." He de-escalated the situation. He changed the script. In that moment, he became the father Riley had always needed. That was the turning point for me. When I heard about that incident, I knew they had a real chance. Change isn't about being perfect. It's about how you recover when you slip up. It's about catching yourself before you fall all the way back into the old, familiar pit of dysfunction. I checked in with the family 6 months after the show, and then again a year later. Riley was enrolled back in community college, but this time she was studying something she was genuinely passionate about, veterinary technology. She was working part-time at an animal shelter. She was building a life for herself on her own terms. Her relationship with her parents was still a work in progress, but it was a relationship. It was real. They had disagreements, but they didn't have blowouts. They were learning to navigate their differences with respect instead of rage. This family story is a powerful reminder that there is no such thing as a bad kid in a vacuum. A child's behavior is almost always a symptom of a larger family system that is out of balance. Riley wasn't the monster her parents thought she was. She was the family's identified patient, the one who was acting out the pain and dysfunction that everyone else was too afraid to acknowledge. By getting her help, and more importantly, by forcing them to look in the mirror, we were able to treat the whole system. They didn't get the quick fix they came looking for. They got something much harder and much more valuable, a real chance to heal. They learned that a family isn't something you have, it's something you build every single day through honesty, accountability, and a whole lot of hard work.